Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Koza. I'm the Director of Education for the Penny Art Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the book club at the center. We're delighted that you're all here with us tonight. Those of you in person enjoying a glass of wine, and those of you online, hopefully you'll come visit us in person next time. Maybe some of my friends there. This evening, we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming back an extraordinary man with an important message to share. Réal is graciously joining us from Sweden. And while it's evening for us here in Buffalo, New York, it is midnight. Am I close, Réal?
That's right.
I felt sorry for him, but then he told me he's usually up to 1 a.m. So we're okay. But thank you so much. We really do appreciate being up late for us or being here with us.
Thank you.
And thank you too for sending along all those copies of books. You can probably see them down the table because I very joyfully gave them away to docents and to those people who join us on a regular basis. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about our book club. For those of you who have never been here before, the book club started in 2011. A lovely docent, Jane Roubaix, who sadly is no longer with us, but has left quite a legacy, had a great idea, and that was to read the books that our namesake, Charles E. Birchfield, read. And that's how we started. But very quickly, we shifted and started reading books written by Western New York authors. And this is in complete alignment with the center's mission to celebrate and support the rich, and it is rich, incredibly rich and creative talents of Western New Yorkers. And that's how we started reading books by people who have a relationship with Western New York. Right now, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, the lovely Michaela Moros, who's going to explain a little bit about the mechanics of tonight's event.
So everyone who is online, if you have questions for Réal, you can unmute yourself and ask. So this will be, same that we've done for the past few months. This is also being recorded, so I will be uploading that to our website and to our YouTube channel probably next week. But you can also use the chat as well if you have questions, but feel free to unmute yourself and that's all I have.
Since we started, we have welcomed over 90 authors to this book club. That's quite a legacy, I must say. And they are authors who wrote every conceivable type of books, from historic fiction to murder mysteries to true crime stories, to narrative nonfiction, to fantasy, and like tonight's author, geopolitical stories of just what could happen if we all work together and have a goal that is worth fighting for. I want to thank Rick Barrow and introduce him. Rick is a newly retired English professor from the University of Buffalo, but you are a freshly minted new docent. So, and this is his first time facilitating. So thank you, Rick, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, welcome, folks. I'm just going to say something about the genre of this book, and then Laplaine will introduce it himself. But I think one of the interesting things that he wants to he describes this as speculative fiction rather than science fiction. And I think that the distinction there is not that it's not scientific, but that he's rejecting the idea. He wants us to think about this as not a fantasy world that's being created, but a speculative world that would be putting into motion, putting into work, stuff that already exists, scientific things that already exist. And in particular, he's interested in putting into motion drones, hacking, and then at the end, it becomes pretty clear that there's AI in it as well. So, Réal, would you like to introduce your book then?
Well, yeah, I'll start off with thanks, Rick, and thank you for being there, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about my book. Little relevance here. I lived in Buffalo for almost 2 years. That was before I connected up with Mary in the book club. My wife and I lived there between 2007, almost to 2010. So we lived up in the Elmwood district area, lovely little area, gem of Buffalo. We fell in love with the city because we lived in Los Angeles before that. I was in Los Angeles and Hollywood, right in the center of Hollywood for 25 years. And honestly, the last place I expected to end up was in Buffalo, and we fell in love with the city. Just wonderful. But in any case, I'm from Canada, born in Montreal, grew up in Toronto, right across from Buffalo. Used to watch Channel 7 News, Channel 7 station all the time because it was the best station in Canada at the time when I was a kid. You probably remember that. I moved to the States when I was 21, and I basically lived in America, in the United States, between Florida and Hollywood for 34 years. And then just after the recession hit in 2008, my wife and I decided, she's from Sweden. We decided to move to Sweden because she wanted to be near her family. So that's the short of it. The book, let me just say this about the book, The 9th Divinity. It's the fourth book in the series called the Keeno Crime Thriller series. And I actually started the Keeno series back, it was the first book I wrote when I started my writing career about 12, 13 years ago. Was a book called Intrusion. And there's plenty of mention in that book about Buffalo too, by the way. I always managed to get Buffalo into my storyline somehow. But the Keeno series are about a Canadian crime fighter who's part of the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I kind of wanted to put Canada on the map in terms of crime fighters because, you know, living in America, it's either James Bond or it's half a dozen other American crime fighters, but you'd never hear about Canadian crime fighters. It's just not on the radar. So I thought I'm going to make my own series, and then maybe someday somebody will make it into a television series or a film series. So the books are kind of written with that perspective. The 9th Divinity, actually, in 2022, when Putin invaded the Ukraine, and just some perspective on this, you know, I'm living over here in Sweden. There's a small body of water that separates Sweden from Russia. They can literally sail their boats across in about an hour. They could fly planes about 15 to 20 minutes, and they're in Sweden. Their ballistic missiles can reach us in about 6 minutes max. So it's very real over here. When Putin invaded Sweden, it was quite a reality adjustment for everybody here in Europe because it suddenly felt as if we were, you know, regressing back to an earlier time. So I decided to write the book and to tie in the Keeno, the thriller, the crime fighting aspect of it, into how would you approach going after Putin? How would you stop Putin without having to engage in mass war, the potential of nuclear retaliation? And I had to figure out a way that, and as Rick said, I had to bring it in from a pure fiction into a speculative fiction to something that, if somebody was reading this, they might even get inspired and go, yeah, he's right. Why are we going to send, you know, thousands of young Americans and Europeans and other people onto a battlefield so that Putin can engage in a bloodbath when maybe a small handful of people, highly trained, elite squad, could go in and just remove him, not even kill him, remove him and bring him to The Hague for to be tried as a war criminal. So a lot of research went into that. And this point that Rick mentioned about, you know, advanced technology like robotic drones, artificial intelligence, and the ability of hackers today. So I took those three elements and I had to build a plan. And could this group, the 9th Divinity, which is what the book is about, is a vigilante group in Canada who decides that through the use of advanced technology, they're going to figure out a way to get into the Kremlin and extract Putin, stop his war machine in the Ukraine, and also go after Kim Jong-un in North Korea, the two major dictators that have the potential right now to launch nuclear weapons and hold the world hostage with those. So that's where the book, that's where the matrix of it began, was in February 2022. So I'm going to just go right into the PowerPoint here at this point. Is that okay? If you're in. I'm going to just pop over on that screen that said what inspired this story. It's about 3. That's the cover, of course. And the next one there, yeah.
Okay, can everyone
There we go.
online see the shared screen okay? I'm gonna take silence as a yes, okay. Continue.
I can take that as a positive. Okay.
Yes.
So what inspired this story? As I mentioned, Putin's invasion of the Ukraine, which is, yeah, it's very real to us over here in Europe. We're living very close to that whole war zone. The second thing that inspired the story was when I started researching the book, I was online and somehow I connected up with a young woman who is a university student in the Ukraine, and she offered to send me information about the war zone, and she was living right in it. And so she inspired me to want to write the book and get it out there. The third thing that inspired the story was the failure of governing powers to stop dictators. And I think we can all agree that it's just gone too far. You know, Putin has reached a point where he has the power to do what he's doing and basically threaten democracy. Kim Jong-un in North Korea is the same. Nobody seems to have an agenda besides preparing large military powers to potentially oppose them. But that isn't really been a very effective approach to stopping dictators from gaining momentum. The third and the fourth thing is the insane growth of nuclear weapons and their threat to our very existence. And on this count, you know, and as you all probably remember, when Putin first invaded the Ukraine, he made a public announcement which went, you know, viral internationally. And he didn't use the words, but he basically insinuated that if anybody tried to stop him, he would retaliate with the worst possible weaponry. And of course, he was referring to his nuclear weapons. So on to the next slide here. Yezvelta Vronska is this woman. I think she's 21 or something like that. She contacted me from Kharkiv, which was, it's on the east, it's a city in eastern Ukraine. And she was the one who offered up to send me videos from friends that she was in touch with. She was living right in Kharkiv, which at that time was being emptied out or abandoned because the Russians were shelling the city. And as you'll see in the slides to come, it's pretty brutal. But she was brave enough to stay there and connect up with different friends living around that part of that region of the Ukraine. And she started sending me videos. And I couldn't, of course, fit that into this PowerPoint, but the videos were brutal. They showed you what was going on the scene. And these were filmed not by the media, but actually by people who were living in the war zone. So that's Yelzaveta, yeah, Ukraine. Next slide. So at the time she was doing research she was actually studying up to be an ecology, a specialist in ecology. She was also writing her own books, and she was an activist. And in actual fact, later, as she and I stayed in touch, she sent me one of her books and we published it for her. And I'll show you that at the end of this presentation. Next slide. Basically, the story she told me was, I mean, it was heartbreaking. I mean, and again, I've only taken out bits and pieces, but just 4 months into the Russian invasion, she was still living in Kharkiv with her, I think it was her mother or grandmother. The city was a major war zone, and the Russians were systematically decimating it. And she described what it was like living there and hunkering down as shells plied the sky, some of them falling right near or into the building where she lived. The sound of gunfire, and moreover, the ghost town that ensued as people were evacuating the city, not to mention the fact that there were dead bodies all around. As you can see in this image here, this is right in her area. Next one's, this is the next one is the actual building where she was living. It's the next slide over there. This is where she was living at the time. As you can see, it's just gutted and bombed. And they fled there. During the process, when I was doing the research and talking to her, she eventually had to flee the city. And I think they ended up in Romania or something like that. I don't know why I put that slide in there, but there you go. It's a good shot. So the threat. It's the next slide. These two boys are the biggest threat to freedom and democracy in the world at this time. Putin has 7,500 nuclear weapons at his disposal. Kim Jong-un, I don't know, maybe he has 40 or 50, but nonetheless, they're two sociopaths with the ability and willingness to use those weapons and constantly threatening to use them against the West. Next one here. The thread behind the book is the fact that war is not the same today as it used to be. In earlier days, we fought wars out on the battlefield and somebody came out victorious, but that's not the case today because the dictators are waging wars with nuclear weapons as their ace card. And these are men who have sociopathic qualities. And as you know, a sociopath is by definition somebody who simply doesn't have remorse or guilt. Unlike the average person, they don't care what harm or pain they cause others because they have no moral conscience about it. And that's the very factor that makes this whole situation so precarious. It doesn't concern them whether or not they would use nuclear weapons if they were pressed with their backs to the wall on this point. A little artist's work there. As I mentioned, Russia's nuclear arsenal is about 7,000. If they launched, and this is, you can look this up on the internet, by the way. Studies have been done if about 100 nuclear warheads were set off at once, anywhere, it would cause not only the obvious decimation and kill millions of people. One of the major factors is that it would actually cause a toxic cloud to rise up and dust and particles and stuff like that into the atmosphere, and you'd have a scenario where almost like Krakatoa, if you know about the nuclear eruption that happened down in the South Pacific back, I think it was about 1893 or something. Krakatoa, this volcano erupted, blew up a whole island, and it actually emitted so much smoke into the atmosphere that actually darkened the skies around the world, and it lasted for several months. And the climatic crisis that we would be looking at if 100 nukes went off, it'd be, well,
Nuclear.
the sun would be cut off. You'd be affecting crops and food production, and I think not to mention the nuclear fallout. That's the power that these two men have right now to hold the world hostage. So Putin. So the purpose of the 9th Divinity, I love the crime series. Writing the crime series, Keeno, is a very popular series. A lot of people like it, the books. But really what this book, or what I wanted to do was the primary objective, it's the next slide, by the way. The primary objective was to expose the fact that our governing powers are failing us by simply reacting to the Russian threat with more machinery of war, instead of doing the right thing, which would be, for instance, as laid out in the book, a surgical approach to remove Putin and his counterpart in North Korea, and eliminating the threat to world peace. And at this point in time, The Hague, the International Court over here in Europe, has declared Putin a war criminal. So if he was treated like any other criminal, well, authorities, law enforcement would be going after them and capture them and bring them to trial so they could stand trial and be accountable for their crimes. But that's not what's happening here. Instead of going after Putin, we're just seeing the same old theater play out again, which is just send thousands of young people out there and spill their blood. And when one man could be removed and stop this insanity. So the next slide, a nice shot of Putin behind bars. What's the story? So the story basically, as Rick sort of implied, is there's, in this story, Keeno and his team, which he has a 4-man team that are part of the RCMP in Canada. I mean, Canada is not a terrorist hub. I mean, as you know, it's a fairly calm nation. It doesn't have a lot of terrorism. It's not a matrix for that kind of thing. But in the wake of 9/11, the RCMP set up a special unit called the ATU, which is the anti-terrorism unit. And Keeno McCole and his partner, Jake Williams, who were both cops at the time in Toronto, were brought on to head up this unit. And they brought in 2 other women as their sort of think tank and forensic specialists. And these guys go after, they're sort of the sharp end of the spear. They go after the bigger threats in Canada. In this case, the book starts out with the 9th Divinity posting a video on YouTube showing, declaring their intent to take Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and all of the dictators in the world and take them down and dismantle their nuclear arsenal, and that they were going to do this despite the military and despite government. And of course, this causes a major row. And Keeno and his team are called into play because the Americans are all upset about it, and other powers is like, how can this vigilante group make such a claim, and what power do they have? And you know, and everybody's kind of worried that it's just going to stir the pot even more and maybe compel Putin or Kim Jong-un to, you know, take it the next step. Keeno is sent out on, and his team go into action, but it turns out as they go, Keeno starts to realize that he's going after the wrong person. He starts to align himself with the 9th Divinity because he sees them as a solution, not a problem. And he doesn't see any criminal activity on their part because in numerous conversations, there's lots of dialogue about this, where he's sort of plagued morally with he's challenged. He said, why am I chasing after this 9th Divinity if their goal is to take out Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un? Where's the criminality in that? But of course, what he gets back is that it's sort of the mediocrity wants to stop this group so that it doesn't stir up more of a snake's pit. Anyhow, he ends up going to the Ukraine because they're tracing down a lead, and one thing leads to another, and he teams up with the 9th Divinity, and they go after Putin. And so the whole story is how they use the advanced technology that the 9th Divinity has at its behest, and use drone technology, AI technology, other thing. They managed to penetrate the Kremlin, and well, the story goes on from there. Lots of action. So in the end, which I don't know, has everybody read the book or
Not everyone.
To the end.
not everyone? Okay.
I did.
Am I ruining the story for you if I tell you too much?
No.
No. I read it today.
No. I mean, in the end, I mean, there's a lot of meat and bones on it. But of course, Keeno and his team are put in a very bad spot because basically they're going up against the RCMP command. They've been ordered to go after the group, and instead of going after them, he decides to align himself with them. And so he's almost viewed as a traitor. But he's operating overseas in the Ukraine. He's out of everybody's reach, and he's just doing it. He's gone rogue. So it's there's a lot of dynamics at play in this thing, but you start to see how much he's plagued by the morality of, like, what side should he be working for at this point in time? Should it be the side that takes out the 9th Divinity and carries on with the war machinery, or should he just go after Putin and try to stop it there? Yeah, so that's the basic story. Next slide. The whole point of, my concern, and of course everybody's concern, is like, what kind of a world are we going to leave for our kids if we just start another war and it leads to a world war, which there's all sorts of news going on right now. I mean, just about every day you see something on CNN, BBC. Over here in Europe, they're talking about Third World War is coming, Third World War is coming. I mean, it's they're painting a bleak picture, but that's the media. I mean, we can't necessarily say it's all true, but the truth of the matter is, from our perspective over here in Europe, it's very real that it could happen. NATO is lining up, the forces are lining up. Sweden has joined NATO. Sweden has been known for being a neutral country for something like, I don't know, 220 years. They haven't been involved in a war. They just maintain their neutrality. But now they see the threat. Finland is building a wall between Finland and Russia. It just goes on and on. So, yeah, for the future sake of our kids, we need to stop it. So this point that Rick brought up about it isn't fiction. If it can happen, then at best it's speculative fiction. In other words, it's entirely possible, and that's what the message I was trying to get across in the book is, that maybe you're reading about artificial intelligence or robotic drones, but all that technology that I depict in the book actually exists right now in the hands of our military and actually private groups too. Probably even more advanced than what I'm suggesting in the book. But the means of penetrating the Kremlin surveillance net, getting to Putin or into North Korea, and using drones and hacking to sabotage their nuclear arsenal, it's just not out of the question anymore. So yeah, it's a speculative fiction. It's not a fiction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just some war notes. What happened to Yzvelta Vronska? Interesting story. As I mentioned, she fled the Ukraine shortly after we started our conversation, and she sent me a whole bunch of material for the book. She also asked if I could help her publish her book, which is a book about Ukraine mythology. It's a story about one of their myths. So we helped her do that. I have a bookstore that I set up called International Writers Inspiring Change, and you'll find the book there if you want to check it out. It's not a long book. I think it's about 80 pages, but it's just a nice story about Ukraine. Well, Lost Souls. That's the next one. Lost Souls, Ukraine Mythology, Book 1. You see that slide there? There you go. Mm-hmm. And the Keeno crime thrillers. There we go. I mentioned earlier that at the end of the book, just to go back a little bit about the crime series here, Keeno is a character that I created a little bit based on my history. He's sort of a mix of Indian and Irish and French, and his background is that he lived. His father died when he was only 2 months old, and then his mother hooks up with another man. The man, when Keeno is 4 years old, tries to murder his mother, and Keeno goes down and stabs him with a knife. A 4-year-old. He doesn't kill him, but the mother has to basically put her son off the radar somewhere. So she moves him over with an uncle of hers who lives out in the bush, and that uncle is based on a character because a real character because I lived with that exact man when I was 6 and 7 years old, or 5, 6, 7 years old. I also lived out in the bush with him. So a lot of it follows sort of the reality of my life and what happened. I didn't have to stab anybody, but I did learn survival skills, just like Keeno is taught. And there's an important character that comes up in the first book, and then all through I think through the second book, an old Indian by the name of Old Joe. And Old Joe teaches Keeno between the ages of 5 and 7 how to survive in the bush, how to use knives, how to use guns. Basically, by the time Keeno is 7 years old, he's proficient with any weapon. And so that's sort of the bedrock for how he becomes a crime fighter later in his life, also compelled by the fact that he had to witness a man trying to kill his mother at the age of 4. So it sort of haunts him. And that you can kind of see through the series that he has this passion for taking down criminals. And he's a maverick. He doesn't like to follow rules. We won't wear an RCMP uniform, but he's so good at what he does that everybody sort of gives him a little bit more margin. At the end of that book, which you'll read, he goes to a funeral for old Joe, which the Indians are holding a tribal area somewhere in Ontario, and he basically honors him. That's how the book ends. And I was mentioning earlier, just before this video started, that I had actually held an Indian ceremony, funeral service here today, not more than about 4 hours ago, from my wife's father, who died this week. And I tried to sort of replicate what I wrote in the book, we burned something that was symbolic of him. I didn't have his body here, obviously, but so that's the Keeno crime thriller series. It's going to be coming out in an audiobook as well in about a month or so, just so you know. So that's my plug.
Thank you, Réal.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to start by asking you about the second part of the frame of the book. The first part, I think, had to do with your wanting to call it speculative rather than science fiction, because it's rooted in the real world. And the other part of that rooting in the real world is the lecture that's given at the beginning of the text about
the sociopath.
Pardon? About the sociopaths, yes. And in that lecture, it's suggested that we are in some ways like blank slates, and that there's not like a natural tendency towards sociopath, but it's some sort of nurture. You call it like the Matrix. People are matrixed into it. And then at the end of the chapter, toward the end of it, there's this paragraph where you're discussing the relationship between soldiers and the sociopaths, and trying to understand like how it happens that regular folk will kill each other. So I just want to read a little bit of this and ask you about the language at the end of it. He says, romanticizing being a soldier, making it a noble and great sacrifice to take up arms and kill other people in the name of some agenda, which is always redacted into something like protect your land or God and country. Whatever popular meme is used, and has been used over and over throughout the ages to turn common people into killing machines. I'm not suggesting that every soldier is a sociopath, but I am drawing a parallel because to indiscriminately murder other human beings, others just like oneself, one must turn off the faucet of empathy, the very quality that makes us human, to lower ourselves to the level of the sociopathic behavior. And like the question I have about that is this image of the faucet or the fountain of empathy, because the lecturer is arguing that there is no kind of like nature cause for this kind of behavior, for being a sociopath, that it's somehow learned, it's a nurture thing in some way. And I'm curious about this language of the faucet of empathy. If like, what is the source the empathy, and how does, and in particular, like thinking about the structure of the book, how do Keeno and Anastasia feel about like the source of empathy? If they don't believe, and I don't think either one of them does, that you're kind of like born a sociopath. Are we born in some way with a faucet of empathy that has to be actively turned off in order to produce this kind of behavior? Or is that also something that is, to use the language of the text, like matrix, like a nurture thing? So I'm curious about what you think about that, and then like how we would think about the attitudes of our two main characters toward that idea.
Well, I think this is a big point about the whole. That's why that lecture is there at the beginning. It's by a professor in the south of Sweden lecturing students who are training as to become sociology specialists and whatever. So I've always viewed this as I'm always fascinated. I watch these documentaries, World War II, and you always ask this question: how can a whole nation be convinced by one man or by a party, the Nazi party at the time, to march off and try to take over the entirety of Europe and create a sort of an Aryan, empire? These were very intelligent people. These were very educated people. These were very proactive people in their society. They were not soldiers to begin with, but somehow the Nazi regime turned them into soldiers. And this point that you mentioned, about the faucet of empathy, you have to turn it off. I mean, if you look at how we train our military, you very much have to get them into a frame of mind where it's okay that once an order is barked out, they start shooting. And it becomes, it's a compulsory response. And yet you come along at a Christmas time and you have the two, this was seen in some films, you see the Germans and the West facing off each other, shooting each other. Then on Christmas at midnight, all the soldiers stop shooting, they get up on the battlefield and they start shaking hands and playing soccer with the Germans, and then they go back the next day and they start killing them.
Yeah.
It's I don't think and this was a subject of a lot of research, like genetic, or is that faucet turned off in a crucible by the culture?
So like I want to push back against again, just to ask, do you think then that there is like a nature version of empathy that,
Yeah.
so like we're kind of like born that way?
Yeah, I think our naturals.
To protect, to respect each other and to.
Yeah, I think that we are born quite empathetic. I think it's part of our nature in general, as proven by the fact that when wars end, everybody goes back to being friends again. It's more natural for us to be empathetic and to have affinity for one another than it is for us to hate one another. And I find that that's a much more, I think love is the most powerful force in the world. And empathy, which comes from that, you can't knock it out of people. You can train them out of them. And as the example is given in that opening lecture with the professor in south of Sweden, he uses Kim Jong-un as an example. He says Kim Jong-un in North Korea was born into an entitled family. His father was already a cruel dictator. And he poses the question of like, how did Kim Jong-un become the mirror image of his father? Well, he was mentored to think that way. He was mentored to think that he was elite, that he was above everybody. But had he not been born into that family, would Kim Jong-un had become a sociopath? You see, that's the question. And I think the answer to that question is that the culture around us. I think if we look around everywhere, you get in a community where there's a lot of crime, kids can grow up to become criminals, but it's the culture that's making them into the criminals.
At the end of the lecture, and I think that this has something to do with the end of the way that the book ends, and the fact that not to spoil the ending, that the 9th Divinity comes up with a kind of solution that is that from Keeno's perspective seems, I think, kind of iffy to him. I mean, he seems very, very big brotherly, and that it's an AI that's going to kind of keep an eye on things and try to
It's like a
head off
watchdog.
sociopaths before. So right at the end of this this lecture, the professor is talking to his class, and he said, understanding the sociological elements which underscore the creation of a sociopath is not only important, but you must also embrace it, because while scientists push the envelope of technology, you, and he's talking to his class, his sociological class, you are the ones who must deal with the dynamics in our society which foster and create these toxic personalities. To an exceptionally large degree, the outcome of the future rests in your hands. And I guess what I want to ask you about is at the end of the book, I mean, it seems like that Anastasia and the 9th Divinity have kind of got like a handle on the technological part, that they've been able to put the drones and the AI and the hacking to work. But what remains a mystery and kind of like not solvable is the formation. So like it seems like the compromise at the end of the book is kind of like, we don't know like how to solve this part of the problem.
Yeah, that's correct.
Does that seem right to you?
No, that's exactly correct. That's correct. I mean, yeah, because we don't have that, we don't have that, excuse me. We don't have the answer to the sociopath yet. There are two camps. There's the camp that says it's genetic, and there's the camp that says they're made in a crucible in the culture. So what I'm trying to imply in the book is that with the one that we can control, I'm not trying to say that I know better than the geneticists, but the one that we certainly can control is, or improve upon, is how we imbue our kids culturally as they grow up, and what we feed them, like that blank slate he had on the slate board, on the whiteboard, so that they come out to become empathetic and humane, and not otherwise, you know. So that I kind of leave that open-ended so that people think on that point, like, yeah, okay, we can go that direction. We can make a better society. We can become more human, or more oriented to human rights and, you know, the international Declaration of Human Rights, so that everybody is thinking along that line. I mean, in a lot of ways, our culture has actually improved in that respect. There's human rights today is a subject that is talked about so much more than when I was, like, you know, back in the 60s, when the racial dissension was at an all-time high, you know. But it still hasn't changed the fact that sociopaths are finding their way into positions of power. We still have the same problem.
Of course.
No, I mean, there's lots of stuff I'd like to ask you about this, but we were getting low on time. I want to give other people a chance to weigh in as well.
Sure.
But one thing that, I mean, I found myself as I read it having a lot of like sympathy for both of the main characters. I felt like Keeno was in a really kind of weird position, because he's always like trying to work like outside of the boxes, willing to like step over boundaries in order to kind of like do the right thing. And he's been constantly being rewarded for like good outcomes, even though he has kind of like broken the rules.
Yeah.
And when he first encounters the 9th Divinity, it's like he can't quite figure out what to do with it because he's being called to chase them down and to do something about them because they appear to be from the paradigm of law enforcement in the Canadian government. They appear to be like a terrorist group. But
Mhm.
gradually he kind of like comes over to the other side. And I'm trying to, one question I have, and eventually I'd like to return to this, is like how does he make the decision about when to break the rules and how does he decide to go with her and the 9th Divinity? But I wanted to get to the real, like, the part of the book that like kind of like took me back the most, which was let's see where she says on page 142, Anastasia and Keeno are having a conversation about the plan. And I think that this is at the point where the plan is slightly falling apart. And the plan seems to have been that the 9th Divinity was going to hack all of the nukes.
Right.
Like in them. And they discover partway through that they're able to like kind of disarm part of the Korean nuclear arsenal and then part of the Russian, but some of it is still alive.
Right.
And then at that point, she says, well, we have to go to plan B. And plan B is Keeno. Plan B is Keeno, and there's this wonderful ambiguity around the phrase, take him out. And take him out most of the time when we hear that in a crime thing like this is like, we'll kill him. And at the beginning of the text, beginning of the story, Keeno seems to be up for that. He said, I wish they'd just shoot him. But then at this point, it's like it becomes, as they're having this conversation, it's like, no, take him out means like capture him and bring him to The Hague. But all of this is like involved in this incredible tension that I'm just totally taken back by what Anastasia says on 142. Keeno says, I can't figure you out. You've managed to stop Putin's invasion, at least temporarily. She interceded. It's not temporary, Keeno. Putin is categorically broke. He has no money to fuel the invasion any longer, but he still has the nukes. That remains his one ace card. And you just help create a narrative for him to use them. And then she says, I did. And if you think for one moment that I feel any guilt about it, I do not. The world is going to come to this juncture one way or another. And that just floored me. Like on one hand, like I get it that she's trying, like the 9th Divinity is trying to introduce like a new paradigm. They succeed in a certain way. At the end of the story, Putin and they're in jail and things have been diffused, but there's also like nukes have been set off. Thousands of people have died. And when she says, like, I feel no guilt about it. Like, I think, whoa, and I have to admit that when she says, the world was gonna come to this juncture anyway. I have to say that, like, what it reminded me of was in the synoptic gospels when Jesus says, you know, the Son of Man has to go. He's like saying about his coming death. Like, I'm gonna die. But woe to the one who betrays me. And I don't think it's like punishment or anything, but like, whoa, you know, like that's a burden. You know, what have I done? And I don't understand why Anastasia doesn't have more guilt about this. Even if, you know, it turns out to be in the long run, like a better world. And there's something really like apocalyptic about this whole scenario of introducing like a new world, a new paradigm, a new way of dealing with people, but still, you know, it's like, how can she sleep? So I
understand.
that was the part of the book that just like kind of stopped me in my tracks.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I'm just going to backtrack one thing just to fill in one point that you brought up. Like, where was the turning point for Keeno? When did he decide to join the other camp? And if that happened when he was in Kharkiv in the Ukraine, when he hooked up with this group, and he was sitting in this, they were in an apartment building that was being shelled. And he was standing there looking out over the city that was on fire. And Kharkiv was just burning, and there were just shells and tracers all over this place. And you could just hear bombs exploding. And he realized, he turns to Jake, his partner, he says, this is insane. I mean, he says, you don't see this when you're sitting in Canada. You don't feel it. You don't see the carnage. You don't see the bodies. You don't smell the taste in your mouth of the explosives and the death. He said, he says, in all good conscience, I cannot.
Yeah, see,
take
like
the
yeah, I mean, that scene is like that time there is really powerful, and there's that discussion about like, what do you believe in?
Yeah.
And Keeno touches his knife. That's what do you believe in? And he touches his knife, and he never explains like exactly what it is he believes in at that point. But it seems to be like something about his ability to kind of take action, I think. And then there's this long discussion about, well, you must believe in something higher, and he doesn't. He says he doesn't, and he has this, and he takes the Ukrainian woman to kind of like task for, you know, like belief in God. He says, like, something like, I think the only gods are like, are in us. It's what we do. And, and
I mean,
she says,
Keeno's
that would be blasphemy.
Right. He has a spiritual side to him, but yeah, you're right. As you see in the whole series, Keeno grew up, you know, he was spawned from a violent event, a trauma. And so he learned from this old Indian and from his uncle when he was, you know, exited away from the city. He learned that he was going to have to survive on his own. And that knife is the knife that he carries with him throughout the whole series. And of course, it saved his life countless times. So when she asks him, do you believe in God? He says, I believe in this. And he pulls the knife out.
Yeah. Well, you know, I got a couple of questions about that because like at the end, which knife does he put in the fire?
He puts in the old knife, the one that was originally given to him way back when he was a kid.
So he keeps the new one that Joe makes for him.
That's right.
Yeah. But your description though of like why he decides to go with this other plan of taking Putin out is exactly why, like, I don't understand why, like how Anastasia can sleep. Because like what he does is he looks out there and he sees this and he realizes this can't go on. And like, I think that I understand that there's I guess there could be some sort of mental calculus that
She's a
that
bit
could
more-
weigh
she's-
means and ends for
Yeah.
her, but like, I don't, like, I don't understand.
No, I understand that. What I was trying to depict in Anastasia was a girl who, I mean, she has her own traumatic background, obviously because of the accident that she was in.
Mhm.
But she's a genius. She's a prodigy, you know, in this whole field. She's like you said, she's a mathematical mind, and she's created this whole world of, you know, robotic drones and an AI, which is called Huxley, based on the book.
Mhm, mhm.
You know, Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World. So she creates this artificial intelligence, which is basically out there acting as a watchdog to protect the freedom of the world by basically exposing dictators and criminals at all levels, even, you know. But I think to answer your question, she's so certain that the nukes are going to be used based on whatever algorithm she's actually worked out, that when Kim Jong-un launches those two nukes in South Korea, the one where he fires off at the American fleet in the Sea of Japan,
Mhm.
and the other one he fires out to at a town in the south of
Yeah.
South Korea. For her, this sort of just corroborates what she's always been saying. It's going to happen. It's inevitable, and it does. Even when they managed to stop Putin, they didn't get to Kim Jong-un in time, and then he fires those two nukes, and then the world has to face the fact that an entire town, city, was eviscerated in less than 5 seconds. And so
Yeah.
it's
I have a question about a different concept, but similar in some ways. The presentation in the book about 9/11 and what really happened in 9/11,
Mm.
that is something that we've been fed that is not actually true. My question to you is whether that is artistic license on your part, literary license on your part, or do you have knowledge, do you have information that suggests indeed that it was something other than what we believe it to be?
an actual fact, a good friend of mine who lives in Buffalo. He was an engineer up in the city of Tonawanda until he retired a few years ago. He is part of a group called 9/11 Engineers. You can look them up on the internet. I think it's called 9/11 Engineers. It's a group that is composed of several hundred engineers from all around the world and scientists and demolition experts and stuff like that. He referred me to this, and I studied up on what they had. They had lots of videos and models that they had created of 9/11 and the research that they had done on the way the building fell. And they came to the conclusion, for the most part, that it was impossible that the building actually fell in its footprint by hitting it at the top with two planes. And there were videos that showed, you know, little puffs of demolition coming off the sides, sort of in sequence, showing some kind of explosive, which, you know, I had worked in Buffalo. I was working in the construction industry. I was staffing companies, and one of my clients was quite a large demolitions company in America. They're situated in Buffalo, and I had seen videos that they showed me of how they did demolitions, and it looked exactly like 9/11. So it wasn't my opinion that I was putting into the book. I was taking a lot of the information that these experts were actually presenting through 9/11 engineers. And that sort of was my main source at the time. And these guys were unbiased. They had no reason. They're not politically oriented. They were not on anybody's payroll. They just simply were offering their expertise. So I hope that answers the question.
So by putting that in your book, have you gotten any pushback or any the opposite, any requests for further information that might elucidate or might construct a different story about 9/11? I was actually stunned by the idea that 9/11 was a totally different scenario than what most of us believe.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I was there too. I lived in America when that all happened. I was in Los
Right.
Angeles at the time. So yeah, of course, the story that was coming out at the time, that seemed to be the only logical explanation. But as far as pushback goes, no, generally speaking, most people who read that or that I have spoken to on the subject, because obviously I've had discussions with others on the matter, tend to agree that it didn't make sense. And then especially when you throw into the mix the fact that the 47-story building across the street from the Twin Towers, which is also mentioned in the book, not generally made known because all the attention was on the Twin Towers, but a few hours later, a 47-story building crumbled to the ground in its footprint. It was neither struck by a plane nor even fragments from the other buildings, and yet it also fell in its footprint. So it becomes a very questionable thing. How do you explain that a building that size just suddenly falls? You see? Unfortunately, I think America was so shocked that everybody just sort of went, yeah, let's just go with this narrative, you know. But a lot of the facts point in another direction.
Could I say something about that? I mean, like when I read that part too, I spent a little bit of time online looking at stuff about 9/11 conspiracy theories, and there's, you know, the consent. It's hard to say which. I think the consensus is more that conspiracy is not right. The kind of normal explanation for the buildings falling because of the planes and stuff like that could be true or is true. And I think in the context of your book, that the really frightening scenario is not the conspiracy theory. The really frightening scenario is the systemic the systemic structure of the arms industry and the various departments of war around the world that have an interest in perpetuating this. I don't think you need like a behind the scenes conspiracy to be scared about how all this stuff continues to happen. I mean, I think to me, I think it's systemic. And there's lobbying going on. I mean, we can't you can't like stop the production of this plane because there's a state that is producing parts for it and they don't want the Pentagon to shut it down. I mean, it's like there's other stuff that explains the persistence of this incredibly frightening situation that doesn't rely on kind of like behind the scenes.
No, we're dealing with an international military infrastructure now that is so much larger than it ever has been in history. And while it's it's justifiable because of whatever the situation, like you said, nevertheless, it's a frightening situation. It's here in Sweden, this is a country that is very, very neutral on all these subjects of, and a very calm, peaceful country, but never really involved in any wars. They sometimes send off troops to assist in various countries, but they're involved in major weapons production now, and shipping stuff out to.
We had a question down the table too, Bob. I saw it first.
I just wondered, do you ever consider or think about the fact of your safety? I mean, you're coming down on two of the most powerful people in the world.
Question.
Well, that's a good point, because I've actually had people write me back on my social media and say, yeah, people have written me back and say, you should be careful what you say.
Mhm.
But
What you eat and drink.
yeah, what you eat and drink. But what I do is I don't go to many restaurants.
Shelley.
A question. So Keeno's Indian upbringing and your own, I
Yes.
saw it through the whole book which I just finished reading today. influenced his decision to go with Anastasia. I felt like, they're not believing in God, but yet they have some belief system. And, believing in nature and the preserving nature. To me,
Yeah.
that seemed like it would be part of the decision.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Keeno's religion is his church is nature. But yeah, for sure, they share a common, there's a commonality there. They're not religious, either one of them, Anastasia or Keeno, but they do see a higher spiritual dynamic about life. And for sure, Keeno's Indian upbringing, and the fact that he was mentored when he was a young boy by this Indian, old Joe, had a big impact on his life. I mean, if there's one guy, if you go and read book 2 in the series, it's called Quantum Assault. That's where old Joe and Keeno team up again, like 30 years later. Keeno is now part of the ATU. In Quantum Assault, old Joe calls Keeno into play because of a human trafficking ring he discovers out in the bush where he lives. And it's a very touching story because old Joe gets killed in a gunfight with Keeno. And at the end of that, Keeno does a special ceremony with the Indians in that village to honor old Joe's death, his passing. But yeah, so he's very much influenced by the whole Indian culture and the respect for nature and this whole concept of spirit animals and stuff like that.
Anyone else online have any comments or questions? You can unmute yourself and ask.
I've been putting things in the chat. I didn't know what the process was. I have not read the book yet. I would like to read the book, but back in the beginning of your presentation, Réal, you mentioned nuclear power and sociopaths, but you didn't mention the US, which has tremendous nuclear capacity. And my question was, what might the effect of having a sociopath in charge of the US?
Not mentioning anything.
Proliferation or nuclear war or prevention
Not
of
necessarily
nuclear war.
fiction, it's speculative fiction.
Speculative, yeah,
Well, yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I totally agree with you. That had crossed my mind. I was going to go into it in the book, but then I decided that could lead me down a political path that I don't want to get into in this story. It could sort of, but the implication was, yeah, imagine America has the other largest storehouse, has 6,000 nuclear weapons, second largest possessor of nuclear. And so if there was a sociopath in a position to press the button, you know,
We're going right
I don't know if you saw the series called Succession. Has anybody seen that series? It's a television series, an American television series. It's about a presidential candidate at the end of the series. And the one thing he says in this one meeting where everybody, up until that point, they're like gunning for him to be the new president of America. He's like a billionaire. Kind of like they're drawing some kind of parallels to Trump. And in this meeting, he says, if provoked, I would do a first strike for sure. And when he says those words, if provoked, I would do a first strike, everybody bails out of his campaign. Everybody sees him as a sociopath. Everybody drops him, right? Like that. He killed the campaign right there. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to get into that point on the book. I think it's implied well enough. It would be a disaster if America had a sociopath up there with.
We've already had one.
Next question I had, thank you, that's I understand your reluctance there. The second thing was, does anyone remember back in, I think it was the 80s, there was a book, I believe it was nonfiction, I can't remember the author, about Ross Perot forming an elite to go into, I believe it was Iran, and rescue hostages.
The book is called On the Wings of Eagles.
Okay, that's the kind of thing, what it sounds like, what your book is kind of advocating is to let's see if we can make that happen again. And I don't understand why it just hasn't happened again with various challenges that the US has faced. I don't.
Exactly. I mean,
Money.
America has the best elite between the American elite SEAL teams and the SAS in Britain. You could put a team together, 100 or 200 people. They could infiltrate Russia. They could get to Putin. They could do it. And I'm so glad that you brought up that book, On the Wings of Eagles. I read that book, and that book actually inspired. It's funny you mentioned it because that planted a seed in my head way back when I read it, like 20 years ago. The very concept that Ross Perot, a private millionaire with his own company, gathers up some of the best ex-veterans from Vietnam, puts a team together. This is when the Khomeini went back into Iran and ousted the president of Iran and declared a war against America in 1979. And all these Americans were stuck there working for Ross Perot's computer company. Because at the time he was preparing a database for the Iranian government. And then when the Ayatollah came in, all those Americans were trapped. So Ross Perot sends a special elite team in, and they get all of those Americans out to a person.
Wow.
An impossible mission in the middle of a war zone. And this is precisely, and so we go back to fiction or speculative fiction. No, Ross Perot did it. He got something like 200 people out of a country that had declared war against America. And we're talking in the 9th Divinity, you get one guy, one little wannabe Hitler, you know?
Well, Obama sent 5 Marines in to take out the Ayatollah.
Exactly.
No, the other guy.
Yeah, not, yeah.
The point of the book, and I
Right.
really want to say this again, is, and like Rick had said, it isn't that it can't be done. The terrifying thing is that people don't want to do it, because in order to do that, how do you justify spending trillions of American tax dollars if you can send a team of 20 people in and they can take Putin out? You can't justify it anymore. You can't justify that military establishment if you can simply do it the easy way and the most logical way without sending all of our young men and women off to die over there.
There's
Well,
a
it's
world
just-
order that says you can't do it. You're
Yeah,
not allowed
precisely.
to do it.
Yeah.
It's a mediocrity, but it's a mentality.
It's a world order.
And that's
I
a
mean,
little
then you
bit,
have
like I
people
said, what
coming
I'm
in to
trying to
kill
poke.
everybody. I mean,
What's
I'm
that?
not
I'm sorry.
saying, I'm not saying that it's not a great idea, but it's just, the world won't allow it.
Well, but
Because then you'd go in and kill every major leader. You could go in
No,
and kill
well,
them.
But there's a difference. The International Court in The Hague has declared Putin a war criminal. They put out a warrant for his arrest if he steps outside of into any NATO country. He is a war criminal. So what's the difference?
That's
Treat him like a
trying
criminal.
him. That's trying him, which is good. And he should be
Mm.
tried, whether
But
it'll be
he has
convicted.
supporters. He's
Oh.
not operating in a vacuum. He has many, many supporters, and that's what we
Right.
forget. It's
Yeah,
not
that's right.
like it would just go away and it would be hunky dory, you know?
No.
These people are, there are so many parallels. They're so obvious. I'm not even going to mention them. But just because you get rid of a sociopath leader does not mean that the cult followers are going to disappear. And so that's what would worry me, is all of the generals under Putin would mobilize, and that's my
I
concern.
agree with you. I agree with you. There's no guarantee that that Russia would change just by taking Putin out, but well, we start somewhere.
Yeah.
So maybe we're gonna end right here. So- Thank you, Réal. Rick, thank you so much for such a lively discussion. Michaela, thank you as always for helping, and thank all of you for being here tonight. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it, and please come back next month, first Thursday of the month, and this is our second time. This was quite a different book than the first book we read, The Buffalo Kid, but a great.
Oh yeah, back then.
Yeah. So thank
And
you.
some of the people in the room read The Buffalo Kid.
I read it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
night.
Good
We'll
night.
see you again, Réal.
All right.
Good everybody.
All right.
Yeah. Now you can go.
Bye now.
Good night, Al. All right, good night, everyone online.
Good night from Sweden.
Yes.